without much more waiting, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to our special guest, Dr. Patricia Jennings. She is a professor at UVA, and she's one of the, I think, Tish, if you want to come on screen, she's one of the top 10 mindfulness researchers you should know, according to Mindful Magazine. And we're so, so grateful that you're here. I've had the opportunity to work with Tish on a project that we are funding the research in a collaborative that she's doing, the Compassionate Schools Project in Jefferson County. It's just been just a pleasure and joy, and I just know that you're going to really, I've learned so much from Tish, and we are just grateful that she is here with us in this January, kicking off our new year with her new book. And so Tish, I just wanted to ask you just a couple of things. When did you start writing Teacher Burnout Turnaround?
It was about 2.5 years ago now is when I first started working on it.
Yeah. And what, I know that you're working care. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about your background with how teacher stress has really sort of come into play as a large part of your professional work?
Sure. Yeah. I am a former teacher and a teacher educator, and I spent about 15 years supervising student teachers, where I had an opportunity to observe teachers and student teachers in action. And I started observing stress in the classroom and seeing how stress interferes with teaching. And I became really interested in it. So I went back to school and got my doctorate and studied stress and coping, and applied that knowledge to supporting teachers' well-being in classroom contexts. Over this time, I developed some interventions, one intervention called CARE, which reduces psychological distress and improves classroom interactions. But over the course of the time I was working on that program and other work, it became more and more evident to me that the whole system needed to be transformed.
Yeah.
And that without that transformational process, the stressors that teachers experience are not going away. I mean,
Yeah.
you can cope with quite a few of them through some of the things we've taught teachers, but there's a bigger problem here. And so that's when I started realizing that I needed to address that.
It's great. Thank you so much. And as we are going to get started, let's find out who's actually with us today. So we're just going to launch a very quick poll and just tell us a little bit about who is in our audience. We've got some options for you on the screen. We'll keep this up for about 60 seconds.
I always like knowing who's here.
Yes. So we'll have some of those up and running. We're going to give you about 30 more seconds to just share.
I fit in every single one of those, actually.
I think I do too. Except for one of them, not quite yet, but I fit into most. We'll give them about 20 more seconds. I see quite a few. And here we go. Let's see. So here is who is in our audience. So we've got about 18%, let's see, 20, 30%, almost close to 30% is teachers, elementary and secondary, student support providers, administrators, higher ed, a couple of parents, nonprofit members, and just curious. So now we want to ask you one more question about the audience. So audience participation, here's your next poll. Which range of years best describes when you attended high school? When did you attend high school? We just want to kind of get a range of generationally where we're all at. When did you attend high school? Which range best describes? I probably should have everyone send us their high school photos, Tish.
That would be good.
My girls still make fun of my hair, but no, that's going to be the constant, I think, for the rest of my life. So what era did you, what range for your high school? And we're going to go ahead and get the poll up and running. Here we go. And here we are, Tish. So it looks like the majority are from the 90s of high school. We've got some, about 13% in the 70s, 31% in the 80s, 36% in the 90s, and sort of the last 20% in the 2000s. So it kind of gives you a nice range. And so with that, Tish, I am going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll and let you take over.
All right.
And we will launch the polls in between when you are ready to go. So without further ado, everyone, enjoy Dr. Tish Jennings.
Thanks. I'll share my screen here. Okay. So to introduce this session, I want to let you know that this one is an introduction to the whole issue. it's, as you might imagine, a complex issue. So this is like an orientation to where we're going and how we got here. So basically addressing stress and teacher stress and burnout. And just to say a word about when I started recognizing the importance of stress in teaching and why it was problematic, I became really surprised. It was actually shocking to learn that nobody had really studied teacher stress until I started working on this in like 2005, 2006. That was quite surprising to me. And maybe it was because nobody had gone from being a teacher to somebody studying stress. But anyway, as I started studying it, I realized how important it is and how it needs to be addressed. And so if you are feeling stressed, you are not alone. It's a common feeling that teachers have. So these 3 sessions where we're going to give you the background that you need to understand how we can turn around burnout and transform our schools. Today, we're going to talk about stress and burnout as an introduction. Part 2 next week, we're going to talk about how do we prepare for transformative change? How do we prepare ourselves and our schools for making the changes that we're going to talk about today that are needed? And then part 3 is how do we empower ourselves in order to do this? So those are the 3 areas of the 3 sessions that are coming up. So as we begin this, I want to take a moment to do a reflective practice. Take a moment to think about this question. Why did you become an educator? And obviously we all have different roles, but whatever role it is, maybe you started as a teacher, now you're a school leader. Why did you become someone who wanted to commit your life to education? And then think a little bit about the values that you hold that motivated this decision. And if you'd like, you can take a moment to write this down for yourself, or you can share your thoughts and feelings in the Q&A box. It'll be interesting to see if there's some commonalities in what underlies our motivation for being in this profession. But checking in and remembering why we got into this is always an important activity, because going back to why did I want to do this? Why did I decide to do this? Helps us remember how to move forward in these areas that we want to, and recommit ourselves again to this really, really important profession that we're engaged in. So we have 1 response so far. Yeah, help resolve the deep inequities in our larger systems, pay it forward. All the opportunities that were given to me by educators that changed my life. Oh, I was a first generation college student. Thank you. Preeti and Aaron. Anybody else want to share? Make a difference. I'm guessing making a difference is a big one. Hotel and restaurant management, quickly realized. Teaching, yeah. I started out as a secretary and decided really quickly that wasn't what I wanted to do. Yeah, create emotionally responsive. One thing I have to say is I know who I'm talking to, and you all are way ahead of where the rest of the system is today. So a lot of the things I'm going to share with you, you may already know. But sometimes a reminder, a refresher, and also putting it in context to this bigger story, I think will be really helpful. So some of you may be familiar with this idea of the school, the history of schooling. The system that we are coping with today, this huge education system in the United States, developed as a way to scale learning before we knew anything about child development or learning science. So the system was set up by people who I think were well-meaning and well-intentioned, but the only model they had for how to scale something so that it could serve masses of people was the factory. And if you look at the system today, you'll see the remnants of this factory in the way that the system's set up. There's uniform, standardized outcomes, right? Like a factory. The system does not value diversity because it values standardization over diversity. And so things in the system are siloed. Um, you expect a student to come in on one side and come out on the other, like an assembly line. The time frames in this system are controlled and uniform, and are identified by bells, which are what you would find in a factory during the early years of the Industrial Revolution. So these systemic attributes are actually incredibly oppressive in many, many, many ways that we all experience from one day to the next. And they do not prepare our students for 21st century. They're also a very unique kind of distortion of the way people learn if you look at human history. In most of human history, we didn't learn like this. And what we need to do is sort of switch over into creating opportunities and creating environments where we take into account learning science and developmental science rather than being so stuck into this oppressive system that we have inherited. One of the analogies I like to use when I talk about the system, this factory system, is agriculture. And we know from a lot of experience that monoculture, which is like this cornfield or whatever this is, it looks like maybe soybeans, when you grow a crop that of seeds that are identical in a large group like this, in a uniform way like this, you can have a large crop, you can accomplish a lot, you can scale this, but you lose a lot of resilience. In comparison, if you look at permaculture, which is a way of cultivating plants that takes into account this diversity, and the diversity supports the life in this community of plants, you have much, much more resilience. So our school systems right now are kind of like monoculture, and we don't take into account the outliers. We're trying to make everything fit into a row that can be harvested with a machine, right? So in the monoculture analogy, a plant or a fruit that doesn't fit into the harvester ends up being thrown out, or it goes into juice, or it goes into feed for animals or whatever, right? And in our school system, the kids that don't fit into the standard end up being also, siloed in different places and put off into different places. And the truth of the matter is that very few of our students actually fit into that narrow standardized ideal that the system kind of wants us to fit into. And today, fitting our students into that isn't healthy for any of us. And it's actually a very difficult thing to have to do. It's one of the biggest stressors that we as teachers are experiencing, is having to get all of our kids to fit into this standard way of learning that doesn't work anymore. What we now know is that in the 21st century, what our students really need to be learning are critical thinking skills, creativity, collaboration, and communication. This is how we function today in adult work environments. We work together, we work in communities, we work together to solve problems. So this is exactly how we need to shift our learning into following this. So we have a lot of work to do in order to make this shift. This quote I love. This comes from Alvin Toffler, who wrote a book back in the 70s called Future Shock. And he says, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So with the rapid change in our society today, we are all going to be having to do this, learn and relearn and unlearn from one period to another. So our kids need to learn how to do this too. So we have a poll for you right now to see your thoughts about this. Before the pandemic, before we were hit with this pandemic, which of these focal areas were emphasized by your school or your district? This is before the pandemic. Can we remember the time before this pandemic?
Just give him about 10 more seconds, Tish.
Okay. So mostly standardized testing and academics. These other areas were not emphasized that much. That's really very interesting. So the next poll we have for you is, which focal areas have been emphasized by your school district since the pandemic? Has that changed at all? And I don't know if this is possible, but I wonder if we can see the results side by side, if that's, do you think we can do that, Chi?
I will try, Tish. I don't know if I can. We can definitely send it out after though, Tish. I know
Yeah,
that.
okay, we can look at it afterwards if we can't see it today.
Just want to give them 20, or let's see, 10 more seconds for voting. And Tish, I don't think you'll be surprised. Here we go.
Ah, I'm not surprised, but I'm actually encouraged that the social emotional learning has really gone up and mental health supports have gone up and standardized testing has gone down. So the point, I'm so glad, Chi, that you added this poll in. This was her idea. Because it's a really good example of how COVID has given us this opportunity that we didn't have before. So we've been coping with this stress matrix, which I was describing. And in my book, I break it down in terms of what are all these stressors that we have to deal with. We deal with our own issues, with our own identities and our own social emotional capacities. We deal with students who are trying to fit into boxes sometimes because the system is making us do that. We're having to deal with the interactions with our students and the interactions among our students, which can also be incredibly challenging. The classroom as a whole can become a stressor depending on how things are set up and what resources you have to draw upon. The school that you're in, the district, the community, and society. All of those things create, they have an impact on us to some degree or another, and they create stress to some degree or another. COVID has kind of cracked that open. It's put us in a situation where everything had to be kind of reinvented. And so as we move out of this pandemic, as we hopefully see the clear sky on the horizon, we can start to think about how we want to come back into our classrooms, and each of these places where we've been feeling stress are opportunity points for us to see how can we turn this around. And so the book offers this opportunity for you to reflect on your stress points and your stressors and your opportunities to make the most of them so that you can empower yourself to make some of these changes in small incremental ways, but also over time with collaboration with others, make big change too. So we all knew that there are a lot of demands when we're teaching. The attentional demands, all paying attention to everything that's going on at the same time, all these different interactions going on with your students, paying attention to this particular student who you know needs your attention more than maybe somebody else. Um, Recognizing, really noticing, am I being equitable? Am I overlooking somebody? Are my implicit biases interfering with what I'm doing? What about the attention to the content? Have I completely missed something? Um, where am I supposed to be right now? What time is it? How much time do I have? So those are all attentional demands. Then there's the emotional demands, because on top of these demands, we are interacting. We have these social interactions going on all the time. We have these expectations, and we have this system that has imposed these expectations on us that are often very unrealistic. I'll give you an example. Here's one. You can control your students. Not really. We cannot control one another. We cannot control our students. We can engage them. We can find ways to collaborate with them. We cannot control them. If we think we're supposed to be controlling them and they're not responding the way we hope they would, obviously we're going to feel threatened, and it's going to create a stress response, and it's going to interfere with our relationship with our students. So that's an emotional component to the interactions that are going on in our classrooms. There's all kinds of other emotional interactions with our school leaders, with our parents, the parents of the kids, with our colleagues. It's a very emotionally challenging job that we have. On top of that, we have all these professional demands. And all of you who are teaching in COVID right now, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the work you're doing, because I know how hard it is. I mean, I'm teaching online too, but I'm teaching college students, which is way different. And one of the challenges I see you all facing that I don't have to face is the logistics of keeping track of who's virtual, who's in person, what days you're in person, what days you're going to be, we already had a lot of logistical challenges when we teach, especially because of this factory model that has created these logistical challenges. But now you add a layer of hybrid learning on top of those logistical challenges, and it's a lot. So I just want to acknowledge that I know that the job is even more challenging than it was with COVID. And I'm just touching on that here. I know there's a lot more to it. So when I started looking at teacher stress and burnout and studying this problem, I started seeing what was going on. And it's kind of, you can see here, it's a vicious cycle. Let's start with the demands I just talked about, these cognitive or attentional and emotional demands. When we start feeling as teachers that we're not able to meet those demands for whatever reason in whatever area, we start to feel emotionally exhausted. you know it's not unusual. A lot of us feel emotionally exhausted. We give it our all, and we can wear ourselves out. When we become emotionally exhausted, we're more likely to become reactive. It's harder to manage your emotional experience when you're feeling exhausted, as probably most of you know. And so we're more likely to overreact to situations in the classroom, maybe unintentionally take personally something a student has done and respond in a way that can trigger some animosity with a student that you didn't intend. This was something that I observed when I first started supervising student teachers, was how it's possible, and it happens actually, to unintentionally create a conflict with a student by misunderstanding or misapprehending what the intention of that student was, and then create a negative spiraling interaction with that student that just creates problems, and it disrupts the whole classroom when that happens. And as the classroom becomes more disruptive, the demands grow, and it becomes more demanding to manage this classroom. And so you have this negative spiral. So one way to support teachers and reduce burnout is to work on these demands. So part of the demand can be addressed through some psychological processes, learning how to cope, learning how to manage emotions, understanding emotions, mindfulness, taking a breath, being aware of how the stress feels and working through that. Some of that can be handled here. And that was very exciting discovery for me. And that's where I started my research in working with the CARE program. Because I thought, well, there are skills we can learn that will help us cope with these demands better. But then when I looked at the whole school and the whole system, I realized that we've also got to find ways to work on those demands. And this book addresses those in particular. So we also have a little bit of leverage, well, a lot of leverage actually right now as teachers. There's been a kind of a history in education of teachers having very little power or efficacy, and also maybe even a kind of learned helplessness. It kind of comes with the culture of education. It's been in the system for a long time. I mean, if we go back to the factory model, women were intentionally recruited, educated women, to be teachers because they could be paid a third of what the men were going to be paid in those buildings. So they made men administrators and they made women teachers. And by the very way it was set up, it was oppressive to women from the very beginning. And the women had very little power in that system. And as time went by, and as the centuries have gone by, or decades have gone by, there have been shifts, but the way the whole system was set up to begin with hasn't completely shifted. So now what you see, for like in this chart, as you can see here, the line that goes up, the dark dotted line, is the projected new demand for teachers over time. And obviously this data is a little bit old. And you can see the projected estimate of the supply are these the vertical lines going down. And you can see that we are right now at a crisis point where the demand for teachers is way outstripping the supply. And that gives teachers power. That gives teachers leverage. And that's why I think my book is coming out at a really important time. The combination of this teacher shortage that you see growing and COVID and recovering from COVID gives us an outstanding opportunity to take the reins and really do what we know we can do, which is to change the way we're teaching in schools. So here's a quote from my book that I really like. So how do we prevent burnout and rebuild this thriving educational workforce? To address this question, we need to consider the current demands and resources and how we as teachers can leverage them to improve our schools and our working conditions. But this is something we can do collectively, but we also have to do individually, because each of these demands are going to be different depending on where we are. So we can do this by increasing the resources, the personal and systemic resources for teaching, while at the same time transforming our work in a way that relieves outmoded and unrealistic demands and improves student outcomes. And the more we do this, the more we do this, the easier our job becomes. Because the more we're oriented towards these 21st century skills, rather than this old factory model, the more enjoyable our teaching becomes, because we're watching our students discover and learn these wonderful skills rather than trying to fit them into boxes like we've been doing. And our students are going to be learning a lot more. And so it's definitely a win-win for us. One of the ways that we can think about the classroom and the resources that we do have to draw on is these 3 survival systems. These are basic core survival systems that human beings have. One of them we're very familiar with is the threat response. When we feel threatened, our body goes through a whole cascade of neurological and other biological reactions to protect us. The affiliation system is one we don't talk about a lot. It's a system of care and connection, and it helps us build relationships with one another that also help us survive. If we didn't have the relationships that we have, human beings would not have been able to be as successful as we are. And this goes back to the parent-child relationship and attachment, where an infant without an adult, or more than one adult, without adults, without a community, an infant would not survive. So these attachment relationships, these community attachments and relationships are core to our survival. And they provide for us an incredible amount of leverage, because when our students and our teachers in our schools feel connected, they feel like they have a role to play, they feel like they're valued, they feel like they have something valuable to contribute to the community. When all that is happening, it's hard to stop a community of doing what you want to do. It's very, very powerful. And the drive system is the part of our being that motivates us to accomplish things that enable us to survive. So the drive to go collect food, or the drive to create shelter and clothing, those would all be under the drive system. In our school system, what we've done all these years, and what the factory model kind of does, is it emphasizes threat, and it uses threat as a way of trying to motivate drive. So it is a punitive model that imagines that if you punish people, then they'll behave better. Or if you give them some negative consequences, then they'll stay on track. And when I say on track, I mean on track, the conveyor belt track, not the human learning track. So, and we've pretty much left affiliation behind in schools. Although SEL and seeing the social emotional learning is now being emphasized in mental health, that is the blue here. So we need to, when we are looking at our systems and we're thinking about how we want to make changes in our system, we think about reducing feelings of threat, reducing those experiences that lead to the stress response being triggered, and promote affiliation in our communities. It will make a big difference. So I've already kind of covered this, the critical importance of this feeling of belonging, but I just want to reemphasize how important this is. And it's really key to how we can transform our schools, because if we can do it together as a community that is committed to this, we can definitely do it. And that means bringing in the whole community. That means bringing in parents. That means bringing in all the different levels of this system that we work in. But if you think about it, the teachers and the parents, that's a lot of people right there. And when you add the students, that's a huge number of people that we're talking about that can be engaged in this. So this leads us to this conversation of collective efficacy. One of the things we know about efficacy, especially when it's collective, is that it is the most influential factor in promoting student achievement. Really, number one. And what is it? It's a group's shared belief in its conjoint capacity to organize and execute the course of action required to produce given levels of attainment. This comes from Bandura back in the 90s. And Hattie did this research, and he found that it's higher than SES. Prior achievement, actually, when I read this, I was really blown away. Prior achievement, the quality of the home, student motivation, concentration, persistence, and engagement. Collective efficacy has a bigger effect size or impact on student achievement than any of these. So this is one of the first places to start. How do we do this? So the first thing, we build this community that I was describing. We find ways to build connection among ourselves in different ways. And in the book, we talk a lot more about that. Once we have this community that is working on different things, when we create groups of diverse stakeholders that have a common cause and are assigned to work on a challenge that they all are concerned about, then they're able to accomplish something together. And a couple things are important with this. When you have a group like this, if you bring in all the stakeholders, then you're giving everybody a chance to share their perspective. That means students, parents, teachers, staff, leadership, because everybody is looking at the problem from a different perspective. Then once this group has made an achievement, and it can be a small achievement, it can be a very small achievement. Once an achievement has been completed, then it's recognizing that and honoring it and showing the value of it. This is how a community starts to feel efficacious together. And so little things in a school, if you're a school leader and you see something needs to happen, finding ways to empower all of the community members to think about whatever the problem is, the challenge is, and work together on it. And then once that problem has been addressed to some degree or another, reinforcing it with positive feedback so that the people who have done it recognize, wow, look what we did. Because it's easy when you're working on these kinds of situations over time to go, oh yeah, we did that last year. Oh yeah, let's do this. Okay, and let's move on. But without acknowledging and recognizing that you have accomplished something, it's hard to build this feeling of efficacy, or this shared efficacy. So take a moment right now to consider this statement. Our school or district has a shared set of beliefs and organizes around courses of action that support those beliefs. I feel like I need background music. Da, 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 da.
I know everyone goes to Jeopardy. That's great. I will just give them about 10 more seconds. I'll go ahead and share the results. Here you go.
Somewhat agree. Well, one of the things I said at the beginning is I know the people who are attending this webinar are already on this path. It sounds like that many of you are already working in communities where this maybe is already starting, which is exciting because there is a lot of good going on right now. There's a lot of new models emerging. So that's encouraging. Oops. So another really key part of managing burnout is building inner resilience. And I'm imagining that many of you are familiar with the CASTLE model of social emotional competencies. I know it's been modified recently. If you're not familiar, there's a new model that just came out that includes the equity, diversity, and inclusion constructs. So when we look at this model for students, we're often thinking through the lens of our students, and that's great. But students learn social emotional skills by observing adults, and it is a growing concern. It is starting to become focused on is adult social emotional learning. There's been this idea that once you're an adult, you're socially emotionally competent. But the problem is social emotional competence is context dependent. So depending on what context you're in, you're going to be more socially or emotionally competent. For example, if they told me tomorrow that I had to go work in a hospital as a nurse, I would have no idea what to do. I don't know how to be a nurse. And I don't have the social emotional competence to know how to manage the demands of being a nurse. It's something that we all learn mostly on the fly as we get into a profession. And one of the reasons teachers burn out is that there's been very little preparation given to most teachers into how do I build the social emotional competence that I need in order to manage the demands of this profession, this job. And you can see these demands in the context of this model. So self-awareness, if to be a teacher and to do this well and to not burn out, I have to have a pretty high level of self-awareness, because I have to be monitoring myself as I'm teaching. On top of all those other attentional demands, I need to be aware of the tone of my voice. I need to be aware of the tension in my body. I need to be aware of what I'm thinking at any given moment and how it might be affecting what I'm saying to my students. That's a lot. That's a pretty high level of self-awareness that most professions don't require. Self-management. I have to manage my emotions in a context where I have no privacy. So if something happens in my classroom that triggers the stress response in me automatically, I have to be able to notice that that's what's happening. I have to be able to go, okay, I'm feeling stress. What do I do? And it might mean modeling what stress looks like and feels like and how to manage it. Talking our students through it, like, rather than hiding it. In this factory model, we've been told that we have to hold ourselves together and we're not supposed to lose it, so to speak. But that's kind of that is an unrealistic expectation. We are going to be emotionally triggered. It's part of life. But we have to be able to notice when it's happening. And one of the things I found most valuable is to be able to say, whoa, I am feeling stress right now. My shoulders are tense. My jaw is tense. And I'm going to take some breaths to calm myself down. And just taking 3 breaths with your students, modeling what that's like, also making that okay. It's okay to feel stressed out. What's not okay is to ignore the feeling of stress or try to suppress it and then allow it to leak out unintentionally in ways that will interrupt learning and interrupt relationships with students. Then when we get into social awareness, there's a high degree of understanding of how our students interact with one another and the kinds of social interactions that create a social community, and how we can contribute to creating a community that is focused on positive interactions and engagement in learning more than anything else. We need relationship skills in many ways. I mean, relationships with students, relationships with their parents, relationships with our colleagues, with our school leaders, and the whole community. And finally, responsible decision making, we know from the Castle model, relies on all these. And in order to be able to make decisions that are equitable and take into account everybody's perspective, these other skills are critical. So this is how adult SEL can support our resilience as teachers. So before we get into our question and answer session, I'd like to lead you through an intention setting process, which is a good way to get started on this journey to school transformation. So I encourage you, this is a mindfulness practice. So if you want to sit up nice and tall in wherever you are, and just take a moment. You can close your eyes if you like, or you can just lower your gaze. And I invite you to take a moment to just notice your body here in this present moment. Feeling the weight of your body on the chair or however you're sitting. Feeling the breath inside your body. Noticing the sensation of the air as it comes in and goes out of your body. And going back to that reflection we did at the beginning of the webinar about why you became an educator. Going back to thinking about that again, considering that. And then imagine for yourself, what is your vision for yourself as an educator? What would it look like? What does your best self look like as an educator? When things are going really well, what does that look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? So when we set intention, it's a regular practice to remember our intention, remember why we're doing what we're doing, and keep ourselves on track. So we might, on a daily basis, want to check in with ourselves and think about something that we're working on and set our intention around that. So, for example, there was a period of time where I realized that I needed to work on the tone of my voice. And so I would set my intention to monitor the tone of my voice and practice a calm voice. That was my intention. I could see my best self as a person with a kind, calm, warm voice. So that's one very practical, concrete example. Another example might be the intention to go with the flow. And that is a more general kind of intention. I'm going to go with what's happening. So just take a moment and think about what you'd like, what intention you'd like to set for today, for this week, going forward. And an intention is not a goal, it's not an end point, it's a direction, it's an orientation. It's some, there's never going to be a point where you're done. So once you've settled on your intention for this practice, I invite you to focus on that intention by either imagining yourself doing what you intend or being how you intend, or you can use words to describe the intention, or both. But the practice involves focusing your attention on this intention in whatever way works best for you. So I invite you to spend a minute or so focusing your attention on your intention. And we can end with a couple of nice, slow, deep breaths. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And so now we have 10 minutes to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tish. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing the screen. Oh, actually, Tish, can you go to the next? I just want to make sure we'll have folks ask questions, but I want to make sure we have our next week prep. And then I think.
And then I have, these are some other books.
Yeah, I think that's great. I just want to leave that up there just for folks to sort of know your whole sort of history of writing. I think is great.